Well, hello everyone. This is Barry Jones with SP History, and we are back for episode 4 of the Martin Luther King series. If you've been following along, you know that in episode 1, I gave the government's case, the case that is in all the history books, the case that all of us were taught. It was in the media, and so far as everybody knows, James Earl Ray was the lone assassin of Martin Luther King, open and shut case. So we went through all the evidence, and there was quite a bit. It was pretty convincing. There was a lot of evidence. It wasn't all physical. A lot of testimony and witness statements, and things of that nature. And if you had stopped at that point, which is sort of what happened because he pled guilty, and so there was no defense, it looked to anyone who was of rational mind and you know that he was guilty. In episodes 2 and 3, I began laying the groundwork for Dr. William Pepper, his relationship, told the backstory, his relationship with Martin Luther King while he was still alive, the relationship with the family, and ultimately his relationship with James Earl Ray, his introduction into the case, which took almost 20 years for him to officially become part of the case. Half of that time was spent in Memphis on his own, quietly investigating, at which time he came to the conclusion that he felt that James Earl Ray was worthy of a new trial in his representation in that trial in an appeals process, because he didn't believe James Earl Ray had first of all, anything to do with the shooting, and secondly, no knowing role in the assassination plot at all. And he had been set up. So during that 10 years and time subsequent, after he made the decision to represent James Earl Ray, I laid out in the last 2 episodes all the evidence that Dr. William Pepper uncovered. All of the players, from FBI to military to Dixie Mafia, the players within each one of those entities, from J. Edgar Hoover and his associate, number 2 man, Clyde Tolson in the FBI, to even the Memphis police and fire chief, who was a recent retiree of the FBI, now is in control of the Memphis scene, Frank Holloman. Talked about the Dixie Mafia and the family, the Atkins family, and how Pepper got the Atkins son, Tyler Atkins, who was an integral part of the family business. In fact, after Daddy died, he and his brother ran it. But of course, he had all the information from the inside, and before he died, testified in a deposition to Dr. William Pepper of his family's role and their collusion, their collaboration with the FBI. And that collaboration, by the way, had involved many other such crimes. This is just the most high profile. It's the one we're talking about. So, and then, of course, in that Dixie Mafia family, even included the surgeon who ended up treating, if you want to call it that, Martin Luther King at St. Joe Hospital. And he was the family doctor of this Atkins family. So they kept it in house. And then we talked about the military and its role, the 902nd Army of Intelligence Unit out of Washington, specifically I'm forgetting his last name. I want to say Bowman, but it wasn't Bowman. It'll come to me. Anyway, he was the high ranking in charge who sent his number 2 to Canada to talk with a fellow whose name would end up being used as an alibi or as a alias for James Earl Ray, and how that was all arranged in advance, and how he sent a sniper team to Memphis that morning from Camp Shelby in Mississippi, along with a photography team to sit on the roof for PSYOP purposes, make a permanent record of everything that happened that morning or that evening. And today we're going to learn that the rifle that did the shoot wasn't the rifle that was attributed to James Earl Ray. It was actually a military issue rifle. that I believe, and Dr. William Pepper believes, was used by Memphis police officer Frank Strausser to commit the assassination. Anyway, we went through all that evidence and talked about James Earl Ray's movements and et cetera, et cetera. So check those out, episodes 2 and 3. Today we're going to start talking about cover up. And the cover up is going to, it's not going to really be necessary initially because the lawyer did his trick, did what he was supposed to do, and convinced his client, the defendant, to plead guilty. And it appeared to anyone who was paying attention that the case was over. And in fact, Dr. William Pepper, for the first 10 years afterwards, even though it was his friend, never suspected foul play, never suspected any kind of conspiracy, assumed the government had the right man, and was surprised when he was asked by um, a Martin Luther King associate, family friend, to go to Brushy Mountain Prison and interview him. And he even asked the question, do you think he might be innocent? You think they got the right guy, et cetera, et cetera. So then it took him 10 more years to come to that conclusion himself. So initially, there was not a need to cover up. But boy, when William Pepper got going and started uncovering all this evidence, talking to these witnesses, et cetera, his story became a very dangerous story. So there's going to be an effort to neutralize him. And then we're going to talk about Judge Joe Brown today, who is the other guy who I consider a very strong source in this matter because he was the last judge to hear James Earl Ray's case. I really made it a priority to seek as my sources people who had intimate knowledge of the case. In other words, they were involved in the case. Mark Lane would have been great, but he's passed from the scene. And I did use his book as a source, but Dr. William Pepper was actually the lawyer who represented James Earl Ray in his appeals process. Mark Lane was early on after the initial conviction. So Pepper is a very strong source. And then Judge Joe Brown being the last judge, of course, he's going to be familiar with all the evidence on both sides. And he was familiar with James Earl Ray's case all the way up till the time he died, which is 98 is when he died. So he is a very strong source. Of course, he's a ballistics expert. And what we're going to find out today is that the FBI screwed the pooch when it came to ballistics in this case. Not that it mattered. The guilty plea foreclosed on any issues with ballistics reports or missing ballistics reports in a trial. So that's where we're looking today. For those of you who are just joining me for the first time, the title here, COINTELPRO gets its man, is the title of the operation the FBI was engaged in, 60s, early 70s. I think they tied it off in 71 or 72, somewhere in that, which was an effort to destabilize and discredit the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, to infiltrate these groups, to launch false flag attacks, to create violent intramural rivalries between the different groups, and to create the impression amongst American people that these hippies or these anti-war protesters were all doped up, drugged out, violent criminals, and their cause wasn't legitimate. Same thing with the civil rights movement. And they're going to be particularly adept at infiltrating these civil rights groups. We're going to see that today and turning these groups against each other. It wasn't organic. This resistance from these groups to one another, a lot of it was fomented by these provocateurs, these FBI provocateurs. It's the oldest method in the book. They've used it and used it and used it and used it to infiltrate the group. And then the infiltrators do things to discredit the group and ultimately destroy the group. It was the FBI version of what the CIA was also doing. We talked about that in earlier episodes when we were talking about RFK, and that was Operation Chaos. which was the CIA version, to do exactly the same thing. So you have the CIA and the FBI simultaneously working at cross purposes with the American population, with American citizens trying to, uh, and we'll get into exactly what methods they used. I mean, it was everything up to and including assassination. That was part of the game plan, but I'll be specific later. So these two agencies, these two rogue agencies, which we're going to find out in the 70s, they were indeed rogue agencies. In the 70s, when the church hearings uncover a lot of it from the documents that come from their own uh, filing cabinets, their own documents are going to reveal to the American people just how rogue the CIA and the FBI had gone during the 60s. All right, sources, just quickly breezing through this. A lot of my source material for the government's case, the evidence that the government used to convict, comes from the JFK assassination records. You say, well, that's JFK. What's MLK? It's all under the same heading. It's the umbrella. JFK assassination records contain RFK records, MLK records, etc. So there's a lot of, and this is publicly available. It comes right from the National Archives. So you can seek them out yourself if you'd like. Dr. Pepper has written 3 books before he died. So those are sources. Judge Joe Brown, we're going to really talk about a lot today. I believe is still alive. And he, as I said, presided over James Earl Ray's final appeal. And he did something that no other judge leading up to that had done, which put him at odds with the government. And there's going to be a consequence for that. This is the book by Mark Lane. Dick Gregory was a prominent civil rights icon, a TV personality. He will come into play today. The story that he tells about the infiltrator into Martin Luther King's inner circle. And of course, Mark Lane was involved in the case way back early on. Garrow tells the story of the FBI involvement. That's where I got a lot of my COINTELPRO information. And then Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson is sort of an anecdotal source. He was there at the scene when Martin Luther King was killed, and he has specific recollections of what happened in that moment that are useful in my theory, which is that, at least to support my theory, which is to say that MLK was set up, and part of that setup involved an infiltrator into his inner circle. So we'll talk about Jesse Jackson today. All right. I want to go through some of there's no way I can go through all of the cover up. Some of it we've already discussed, but I just want to highlight some more pieces of evidence that were covered up. And they start to paint a picture when you ask the question, why were they covered up? For example, one of the most effective tools the government has to cover up in any one of these cases we've discussed so far, whether it be JFK, RFK, or in this case, MLK, is to get the media on your side, have a narrative, and spread that narrative to all your captured media outlets, and then let them do the dirty work of spreading the word. And then if anyone were to counter that or to question that, use the term conspiracy theorists to smear those people. The media plays an important role. They choose what they're going to cover. And sometimes, like in this case, the first 2 examples I'm going to give you are of media blackout, which they just chose not to cover certain things, which is just almost the same. It pretty much is the same as parroting the government narrative, which was a lie. The first example is that in that 1999 civil trial, after which it only took the jury 59 minutes to decide that James Earl Ray was not the guilty assassin, in fact, had no knowing role, that it was actually small-time player Lloyd Jowers had a small role, but it was really, in actuality, carried out by a conspiracy of officers of the United States government, state of Tennessee, and the city of Memphis. That is the result of the 1999 civil trial. Now, the Martin Luther King family only asked for $100. They didn't want to taint this process of searching for the truth with a money grab, with even the appearance of a money grab. And so, because the case was decided in such a way that didn't support the government narrative, or i.e. the media narrative, it wasn't covered. And because it wasn't involving a huge dollar amount, it wasn't covered. I've heard representatives of the Martin Luther King family say with some regret today that they should have asked for millions of dollars, not because they needed the money, they could have donated it, but to at least attract some more media attention. Either way, they blacked out. It's hard. You get online and try to find any word or any documents or any newspaper clippings or stories about the 1999 civil trial in Memphis. It's next to impossible to find anything. I know a lot about it because I read Dr. William Pepper's books. He was the lawyer of record in that case. And Judge Joe Brown knew a lot about that case. It happened in Memphis where he was a judge. But if you're just online looking for a news article about it, good luck. It was totally blacked out. Reminds me of that JFK case, also a civil trial, where Marita Loren's story caused the jury to come back with the conclusion or a verdict that E. Howard Hunt was not defamed when he was named by Liberty Lobby as one of the conspirators in the assassination because he worked for the CIA, and in their view, the CIA killed the president. That was an actual civil court case verdict, just like this civil court case verdict. But civil cases are different from criminal cases. And the media almost has an option to cover a civil case. They don't have an option to cover a criminal case. So the conspirators in both these cases can live with a civil verdict that goes wrong or goes bad for them. They cannot live with a criminal verdict that doesn't go according to plan. They'll move heaven and earth to rig a criminal court trial, whether before, during, or afterwards. In a civil case, they'll live with it because the media probably won't cover it anyway. In both these cases, it did. A second example of media blackout is what happened to some of the very important evidence that didn't support the government narrative that all the shot came from where I have circled there in red, that bathroom in the rooming house. There used to be a tree right in the way. Now, there's still a tree line there, but they trimmed the trees. After the assassination, those trees, or at least one of them, according to several witnesses, including Eric Caldwell, the New York Times reporter who took pictures of it, the tree limb made it almost impossible from where his vantage point at the Lorraine Hotel to see that bathroom window. Now, you could, if you got on the second floor, you could, if you looked hard, you could look through the tree branches and you could see, but it wasn't easy. The city came the next day and trimmed down those trees, and they've kept them trimmed down like that ever since. I took this picture when I was in Memphis, and it's relatively recent. I think we were there 3 years ago. And so you can see two things if you've been following my videos. First of all, those trees have been trimmed and kept short, just like the Texas live oak on Elm Street there in Dallas. Same thing. On the day that Kennedy was shot, that Texas live oak was in the way, and it was November, and live oaks don't lose their leaves until the following spring, so it was full of leaves, and it was an obstacle. Well, it isn't anymore. The city of Dallas keeps it trimmed, just like the city of Memphis keeps these trimmed. This happened the day after the assassination, so it's almost like somebody in the Memphis city government knew that could be a problem. We need to get out there ASAP and take care of that problem so that it's not used as a defense to support James Earl Ray's case. The second thing you should notice is that where that wrought iron fence is, on the day Martin Luther King was assassinated, it didn't look like that at all. It was a ratty ass mess of bushes, untamed, untrimmed, just a mess. Look, it was a real mess. I mean, it looks much better now. There's no question. But that's not how it was. When Martin Luther King was shot, those bushes that ran the length of where that wrought iron fence is on top of that retaining wall uh, provided perfect cover for Frank Strausser, according to several witnesses, the shooter, and Earl Clark, according to several witnesses, the spotter, to hide themselves in that bush line. And of course, being up on that, you can see there's a little knoll there on top of the retaining wall. So that's where the bushes were. And so you're about 8, 9 feet off the ground, and you already are elevated over the Lorraine Motel, which is across the street. You're about even with the roof line of the Lorraine, which means you're firing down at whoever's standing on the second floor balcony. And of course, the autopsy report said that the bullet traveled in a downward trajectory. Anyway, the city cut out all those bushes. The same time that they cut out the trees, cut off the limbs, trimmed them, they cut out all the bushes. And we know this because Earl Clark was the New York Times reporter. And I went through a long list of witnesses who said the shooter and the spotter were spotted in the bushes. And Earl Clark was one of them. When he came running out of the Lorraine, he saw Earl Clark hop down over that retaining wall and run over to a police car, get in, and take off. And when he talked to Sullivan Jones, the taxi driver who was chauffeuring Martin Luther King around, sitting there in the parking lot at Lorraine, he said he saw the shooter in the bushes along with Earl Clark. And a house cleaning lady saw it. And there were others, okay, multiple witnesses who saw that. And so he noted and took pictures of the bush line because according to everybody he's talking to, that's where the shots came from. And then he left the city for one day to be with Martin Luther King's body on the plane, escort him back to Atlanta. Then when he returned the following day to Memphis to pick up his stuff from the Lorraine, he noticed this. All the bushes were gone and the trees were trimmed. And he's like, and, you know, I gave you that quote. He says, no, Tom, Dick, not just any Tom, Dick, and Harry could do that. That was organized, arranged, somebody at the top, somebody high up who realized that could be a problem. So let's just clean it up, get rid of evidence. This reminds me of, you know, it's destruction of evidence. It's like, it's no different than the Secret Service wiping down and cleaning the limousine, which was the rolling crime scene, right? And then sending it off to Dearborn before it can be, you know, examined for shell casings or anything else that might be in there. And they replaced the windshield, which had a bullet hole in it, which was inconvenient to the narrative, which all the shots came from behind. Shell casings were cleaned up. I mean, all the blood, you know, I mean, all the evidence was destroyed. That was the crime scene. The car was the part of the crime scene. Just like here, this is part of the crime scene. They come in, they destroy the evidence. So, but no word of that from the media to anybody. It never was raised. The issue was never raised. And the only reason we know about it to this day is because Earl Clark, the New York Times reporter, wrote about it, noted it in his notes. And in 1999, when they finally looked at his notes, the FBI, that's where it was. And of course, William Pepper talked to him and he found out from him what had happened. And other witnesses noted this as well. But as far as the official investigation and the media reports of all the goings on around the crime scene, it was just it was blacked out. It was a media blackout. Another way that the government covers up after cooperating with the media and getting the media to do its part is to enlist the help of editors and publishers who aren't necessarily in the media as far as like newspapers and television stations, but they're still part of the media. And authors, books that come out subsequent, and here's these researchers who get in and look at the cases that these conspirators are trying to rig. That could be dangerous for an author or for a researcher to come across the truth, stumble across the truth, find a publisher who's willing to publish it, and then come out with a bombshell book. So they cover all their bases, is what I'm saying. These next two examples illustrate that. Bill Atwood, you should recognize his name. He is a former ambassador. In fact, he came up in the JFK case when we were talking about 63, the back channel between Kennedy and Castro. It was Bill Atwood and Lisa Howard who were serving as those back channels. And the reason we found out about it is because the CIA tapped his phones and then leaked it to all the Miami conspirators who viewed it as the final betrayal, JFK's final betrayal. I'm talking about the Cubans, mafia, and of course the CIA viewed it that way as well. Bill Atwood was an honorable man. He just got, I don't know, I wouldn't call it sloppy. He was just naive to think that his phones wouldn't be tapped. He even admitted so afterwards. I wish like hell I hadn't talked on that phone, basically. So let's talk about the Bill Atwood story. It involves Dr. Pepper. He was the publisher and managing editor in 68 of Look magazine. And he was interested in publishing some of Pepper's work in 68. Now, at that time, Pepper's work was basically the Vietnam War. That's how he met Martin Luther King. That's how they became friends and associates. His opposition to that war. And I told you the story how he'd been on location in Vietnam, but his stories were so anti-war that he became viewed as a troublemaker in Vietnam and ultimately got shot, sent home. But he had files and files and files of pictures, a lot of pictures especially, but stories about war crimes involving American soldiers and the American policy in general, which was making war against civilians. And that's what he brought to the table in 68. And so Atwood wanted Pepper to write a story or a column or some sort of work to be published in his magazine, Look magazine. And 1 week before he met with Pepper, Atwood received a visit at his office from Averell Harriman. Now, Averell Harriman, pictured top right here, is like one of the deepest deep state figures in our country at that time. He's a big shot. He's the founder of Brown Brothers Harriman and Company, which is, right up there with Sullivan and Cromwell. You're talking about lawyers and investors and guys who control politics, and these folks are big time movers and shakers when it comes not just to American foreign policy or fiscal policy, but also international finance and international business and even war. This is a big shot. He was Secretary of Commerce under Harry Truman. He was governor of New York for a term. He was two-time candidate for Democrat nomination for president, lost both times. He was a foreign policy advisor to multiple Democrat presidents. And at this time that he visits Atwood, he is serving as an advisor to LBJ, the current president. So this is a big shot. Pictured here on that bottom is a cover story about same magazine, Look magazine, the story of James Earl Ray and the conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King. Now, this will come out years later, obviously, but this is the kind of publication that Look magazine was. It would publish the hard stories. Right now, they're looking for some Vietnam stuff. 68, the Vietnam War is in full, it's full go. It's very controversial. It's the main issue in the 68 presidential campaign. And so if you're a publisher and editor, managing editor in any magazine, you're looking for anything Vietnam related because it will sell magazines. And it'll create, if you can get some inside scoop like Dr. Pepper has, it could be a blockbuster story. Anyway, Harriman shows up unannounced. Atwood has no idea he's coming. He just shows up. And he says to Atwood, he says, I bring greetings from President Johnson and also a request from President Johnson. I need a favor on behalf of the president. So they went into Atwood's office. And now the reason we know about this is because Atwood is telling this story to Pepper. Remember, he's meeting with Harriman a week earlier, and then a week later, he's going to meet with Pepper and try to negotiate a contract for the story. And so when they finally meet, him and Pepper, he tells him, "Hey, you're never going to believe what happened last week. I got this unannounced visit from Averill Harriman." And of course, Pepper's like, "What's that got to do with me?" So Atwood is telling him the story. Here's what it has to do with you. So when Harriman tells Atwood what the favor is that LBJ wants, he says, quote, "The president would be very grateful if you would never publish anything that Bill Pepper wrote." That's the favor. And so somebody knows in the White House that Look magazine is trying to negotiate a contract with Pepper, is fixing to meet with him a week away. And so they send Harriman to pass word along from LBJ straight from the Oval Office that we don't want you to do this. We don't want you to publish anything that guy writes. Atwood responded to him, quote, "We're going to meet Pepper next week. If we believe in what he has to say, we're going to publish. Please give the president my best regards." Pepper says, I've heard him say it several times, regarding Bill Atwood, he says he's a fine and honorable man. And he says we need more people like him in media today, people that are strong enough to stand up to the bullying tactics of the powerful, the elites, and do the hard thing, which is to publish a story which might not be all that complimentary, might bring some heat on him. And so that you're talking about, an honorable person. This is a guy who tried on behalf of JFK to negotiate or be the intermediary to help negotiate a peaceful resolution to the Cuban conflict back in '63. It got sabotaged by the CIA when they bugged his phones. Here he is in '68 trying to be honorable and resist LBJ's tactics and publish the story that Pepper wrote, whether it helps him or hurts him when it comes to his career. This is an honorable guy. He's an honest broker. Unfortunately, it's not going to end well for him, but we'll get to that. 1 week later, after these two meetings, he's first met with Averill Harriman, and a week later he meets with Pepper. A week later, this is the third week now, he meets with Jim Garrison for 6 hours. Now, this is right at the height of the Garrison trial down in New Orleans, the Clay Shaw trial. And so this guy is looking to write big stories. He's meeting with Pepper about the Vietnam story, and then he's meeting with Garrison about the JFK story. And they meet for 6 hours. And after the meeting, Atwood is so shook up about what Jim Garrison has told him that at 1 a.m. he calls Bobby Kennedy. And he says, "Bobby." So evidently they had a relationship, and it stands to reason because Atwood had a relationship with JFK, Bobby's brother. He said, "Bobby, I'm shaking in my shoes. I just had this long meeting with the district attorney in New Orleans, and he has shaken me to such an extent. He's convinced me that CIA operatives killed your brother." And according to Pepper, and we're getting this story from Pepper after, because Bill Atwood shared it with him later. They developed a pretty close relationship. And according to Pepper, Bobby told Atwood, "We know that, but I've got to get to the White House to reopen this case." By the way, I've got a picture down here, and you may be wondering what. First of all, Garrison is the top picture, and that's a picture from about the '67, '68 time frame. So he's a younger version. Most of the pictures show him as an older guy. By the way, I don't know if people realize this. They called him the gentle giant. Jim Garrison was about 6'7". He was a big man. The bottom picture is interesting. This is Bobby with Harry. His name is Enrique. They called him Harry Ruiz Williams. This is Bobby's contact down in Miami, and he's the inside man for Bobby and the Cuban refugee population down there. And he had right after the assassination of his brother, he had called Harry Ruiz Williams, And he had told him that he believed the Cubans did it. He said, one of your people did it. What he meant really was one of our people did it, because Bobby was over all of Operation Mongoose, and it used the Cubans to do the dirty work. And it trained them specifically in the skill of shooting a moving target from distance with a high-powered rifle and a scope, which is exactly how JFK died. He not only told Harry Ruiz Williams this, he told the CIA director that he believed the CIA was involved, and he sent his own private investigator to go down to Miami and New Orleans and Chicago and investigate the mob. Bobby knew immediately after the assassination of his brother that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. He knew who the major players were. And he told folks, if you care to investigate, research it, he told Harry Ruiz Williams. He told the director of the CIA. He told his private investigator. It's the mob. It's the CIA. It's the Cubans. And 1 week before his own death in LA, when he's running for president, he told a newspaper reporter that if he won, he was going to reopen the case into the JFK assassination, his brother. So here's corroboration of that, him telling, or him hearing straight from Bobby's mouth, Atwood, that Bobby is saying, listen, I know who killed my brother. I can't do anything about it till I get back to the White House. That's when I can reopen this case. So this is a fascinating account for several reasons. It shows that Atwood is a real honest broker. He's courageous. He's willing to write a story that goes against the president's wishes about Vietnam, and he's currently investigating a story about the JFK assassination and talking to the guy who is leading the effort now in New Orleans. Not just talking to a third-party source. He's talking to the district attorney, Jim Garrison. So first of all, it says a lot about Bill Atwood. Secondly, it confirms yet again what Bobby's intentions were once he got into the White House, which adds motive to what happened to him on, in June of '68. But we haven't got to the best part of the story yet. Atwood's phone call to RFK was at 1 a.m., as we previously noted. Remember, he'd just come off that 6-hour meeting with Garrison. At 4 a.m., he has a debilitating heart attack, leaves him almost completely incapacitated, which means he's out as managing editor and publisher of Look magazine, and he didn't live a whole lot longer after that. Several years after Atwood died, Atwood's widow told Pepper, quote, Bill had a lot of respect for you and your work. Please leave me out of this. By this point, Pepper was representing both James Earl Ray and the Martin Luther King family in the appeals cases. She said, don't bring me into this in any way. I have to raise 2 children in this country. It's clear she doesn't believe what happened to her husband was death by natural causes. And indeed, in the 70s, we learned that the CIA had mastered techniques to kill people. It's called termination with extreme prejudice, TWEP. It was a program to kill people, witnesses, whatever, even assassinate people, and leave their bodies in such a condition that a medical exam would show that they died of natural causes. There's that famous picture of Frank Church, the Church Commission. This is when they found this out. This is straight from the CIA documents, by the way, holding up that famous gun, the heart attack gun. So heart attack was one way, heart failure. Another was cancer. They had cancer drugs that they could insert into people's food, inject into people, et cetera, et cetera. So when he dies or when he has his heart attack, we don't know yet what the CIA is up to, what they have the capability to do. We find out in the mid-70s, all of a sudden it calls into question a lot of mysterious deaths by heart attack, by cancer, by so-called natural causes. It just so happened they were inconvenient, either witnesses or somehow they were inconvenient to the CIA. And Bill Atwood's wife was one of these who suspected that her husband became a problem because he was so courageous and so brave and so willing to publish these stories that powerful people didn't want him to publish. And perhaps, again, his phone was bugged. We don't know. And that phone call that he had with Bobby alerted people on the other end that this Bell Atwood had become a problem again, just like he'd become a problem 63 when JFK was president. In that case, you eliminate JFK and that problem goes away because the negotiation was not between Bill Atwood and Fidel Castro. It was between JFK and Fidel Castro. In this case, he had a position of authority, of responsibility, of influence where he could publish these stories. And right after that phone call, it's pretty much the end of his career. It was the end of his career, pretty much the end of his life. So this is an example of how the government plays hardball with the media, who, they control most of the media, but those wild cards that they don't control, they communicate to them, either verbally or non-verbally, that they're going to get their way with or without you. And so the Avril Harriman story, how he comes bringing a message from LBJ trying to bully Atwood into not publishing anything that Bill Pepper had to write. And then the continuation of that story, his interaction with Bobby and what happened to Atwood, I think shows or illustrates how the government exercises its power over everybody, including the media. Now, here's an example where, again, the media is used to cover up evidence that Bill Pepper had. This is my fourth example. This is Harper and Collins, which pretty prominent publishing company in those days, won an auction to publish Perry's book, Orders to Kill. And afterwards, Pepper, who was living in London with his family at the time because he'd been threatened, his family's life had been threatened, so they fled the country and lived in London. He got a phone call from the president, Harper and Collins, and the president made him an offer he thought he couldn't refuse. It went like this. He said to Pepper, he says, quote, "Yes, we want to publish your book. We'll make you a millionaire. You'll be a wealthy man. You'll be well known. The story will be well told, but you have to take out one chapter." All right, there's the carrot. So what's the stick? The carrot is you're going to be rich and famous. The stick is you got to take out which chapter? When Pepper asked which chapter, the president replied, quote, "The chapter on the military. We cannot publish your book showing the government of the United States through its military having any involvement at all in this case. It would be so damaging to our bottom line. We would have problems with the IRS and the FCC. It's just not something we can do. You can write another book about it at another time, no doubt with a different publisher. But this book, if you want us to publish, we can't do it as is." Now, Pepper initially thought about it, but then realized I can't go along with that. The military is an integral part of the evidence. So he refused the offer and he published later through a smaller publisher so he could write the whole story. I include these cases just to show you the power and the reach, the leverage the government has when they decide they want to cover something up. He noted in here that they would have problems with the IRS and the FCC, the agencies that are in charge of taxes and your license, as far as communication is concerned, if you're in that line of work. It's a small thing for the government to sick those agencies on your enemies. And, the president of Harper and Collins was hip to that. He knew exactly what would happen if they printed this story. So it makes you wonder how many other times this happens, even today, right? And then you see these stories that just parrot the government narrative, just whatever the government wants them to say, they say. And then we see the other case where they actually send somebody to try to bully, in the case of Avril Harriman, to try to use LBJ as a bully tactic to prevent Pepper from having any of his work published in Look magazine. And so these are just ways that Pepper had personal experience with, that the government was trying to prohibit him specifically from publishing any of his work. Now in 68, it was about the war, right? And of course, LBJ was still in that mode where he was thinking about, he's got to run for re-election. And he could not afford any negative stories about Vietnam. And so he was very interested in preventing, he knew what kind of work Pepper was going to do. He knew what that story was going to look like. So here he is trying, it reminds me of the Hunter Biden story, right? Discredit it or shut it down. It squelch it. It's nothing new. Leaders have been doing this from the beginning of time, I'm sure. So that was going to be a Vietnam story, 68. Now, what William Pepper is going to go on to do years later is investigate other government corruption examples, and specifically Martin Luther King and even RFK. And so Pepper is going to make a career of being a troublesome person for the government. Abbott was one of these honest brokers in media. You don't have a lot of them. And he may have paid for being an honest broker with his life. I know for a fact his phones were bugged in 63 when he was helping JFK. I believe his phones were bugged again in 68, and he was taken care of. I can't prove it, but that's my belief. The cover-up continued as and none of this is new. It still continues to this day. But here's what the government has access to in the way of covering up. They can withhold evidence and documents. The whole reason I'm doing this series is because 55, 60 years later after the event, Trump has finally ordered the release of declassification of some of these documents, and we're starting to get some of them. And we got some JFK documents, not all of them, some more. But it's been 60 years and we still don't have them all. Same thing with the Martin Luther King documents, same thing with the RFK documents. They just withhold. They classify everything. And so it complicates the release. And of course, they go through several dispensations, right? First, they withhold because it's classified. Then when it's declassified, they redact everything that's of importance or of note. So what you get left is a document, half of the words are redacted. And so much time has gone by, it's just dribs and drabs, pieces here, pieces there, witnesses have died, and it's difficult to put all this stuff together. And that's the whole point of it. Just delay. Same thing, that's what documents, same thing with evidence. They just withhold it. We already discussed how Dr. William Pepper found 2 eyewitnesses who stated in their statements to the police and the FBI that James Earl Ray was not even on the scene when the shots happened. They saw him in his car driving away, and they buried it at the bottom of a file drawer in the district attorney's office in Shelby County. It never got handed over to the defense. They buried it. They withheld it. Right? And so that's one way that they cover up. Another way is to set up and try a patsy. In all these cases that we've discussed so far, JFK, RFK, MLK, they set somebody up because they know it's a psyop. They know the American people have, humans in general, when something unexplained and traumatic happens like this, there is this need to have answers, to have somebody pay the price for what just happened. And so they satisfy that need by preparing in advance a cover story which implicates this poor patsy, and boom, they make a quick arrest, and their media picks up and does the rest, and then if they have to, if they're going to go to trial, they arrange the attorney to play along. They find an attorney who's compromised and so on, and they get the attorney to either get his client to confess or to plead guilty, whatever. And then you get a judge who's on your side. You co-opt the judge, and then you just batten down the hatches and don't let the appeals process work itself out honestly. You rig everything. And in some cases, if the problem is too great, you can't afford a trial at all, can't afford to defend it, getting on that stand, you just kill him, like Lee Harvey Oswald, and convict him after his death where he can't defend himself. I'm outside and I got some bugs flying around. Sorry about that. It's interesting that the patsies in these three cases, Lee Harvey Oswald was CIA. He was a CIA asset. He was military intelligence. He was recruited into the Office of Naval Intelligence when he was in the Marine Corps. So he's an asset. They could not afford for him to stand trial. He already claimed he was a patsy to the media. They didn't know what he's going to say, but they knew it wasn't going to be good. So they just killed him. He knows too much. The other two are just dupes. And you can basically get them to do whatever you want. Sirhan, pretty clear that his attorney was working for the mob. And he basically was going to do whatever, these are young kids, right? Sirhan was 24. He's going to do whatever his attorney tells him to do, which he confessed. Then later, when he realized, oh crap, he tried to retract his confession, fire his lawyer, judge wouldn't let him. And that became the pretext for a conviction, and all subsequent paroles were denied because he, well, a lot of people believe he was MK Ultra. He was part of the MK Ultra program, which means he was just programmed to do what he did and have no memory of it. Part of the parole stipulation is that you express remorse for what you did. How are you supposed to express remorse for what you did if you can't remember it? So he's in a catch-22 situation. The other one, James Earl Ray, again, a co-opted attorney and judge, and they tell him basically your only choice is between an execution and pleading guilty. If you plead guilty, at least you're still alive, and then I'll give you $500. You can go hire a new lawyer, and you can have a new trial, and you can fight your case then. He says, I'm not in good health. I'm not going to give you a good defense right now. But it's too late in the game to change out lawyers, and so you better just plead guilty and then live to fight another day. He did, and then realized he'd been screwed. So they set up and they try these patsies, and then the real conspirators get away scot-free. They smear, in this case, the King family, Dr. Pepper, everyone who tried to fight for James Earl Ray, everyone who tried to fight for the truth and what happened to Martin Luther King. They smear them, and that's been the case. JFK, RFK, you're a conspiracy theorist, on and on. They sabotage legal proceedings. We're going to talk about that going forward here, because they control all the levers of all the legal machinery they control. And so, it's like, for example, Steve, off the top of my head, after the JFK case or assassination, LBJ appoints the Warren Commission to investigate. Who's basically running the Warren Commission? CIA through Alan Dulles. In other words, the Fox is investigating the hen house. Then you get to RFK, and because I believe the CIA killed JFK. Then you get to RFK, CIA again killed through thing Eugene Caesar, RFK, and they've got the CIA completely controlling the LA Police Department. The guys in charge of the investigation are CIA assets. So, and then you get to MLK, and now it's the FBI. And again, it's the FBI, Frank Holloman, who's in charge of police and fire in Memphis. He's an FBI guy. And so you get the FBI handling the investigation, and they're the ones that killed him. The CIA handled the investigations, JFK and RFK, and they're the ones that killed him. So they sabotage the legal proceedings, and that includes the investigations, which you feed into the legal proceedings. And then they sponsor books from friendly, they oppose books or publishers or editors who might publish something that is counter to the narrative. And then they give out these contracts, these book contracts, publishing contracts, to their authors, their captured authors. I've got Gerald Posner's books here. Posner's, he's been the biggest apologist for the lone gunman narratives in both JFK and MLK. And every time you turn on the TV and they're talking about the JFK case or the MLK case, mostly JFK, it's always Posner who's bandied about by the media as the resident expert. And yeah, he's this lone gunman apologist, and about half of his evidence doesn't even hold up anymore. And he's still considered to be this expert. It's ridiculous. But they're the ones who get the big book contracts. And their books are the ones on the New York Times, top 10, whatever. And that's who gets on TV, et cetera, et cetera. And so the narrative just gets pushed. They cover up the evidence that's not convenient, and they put in our face a patsy so that we satisfy that bloodlust we have for revenge. They smear anybody and destroy people that try to investigate and come to the real truth. They rig the whole legal proceedings and the investigation, and they sponsor all these authors to write these books furthering their case, their narrative. That's how the government covers up. I wanted to talk specifically about sabotaging legal proceedings, and I want to give you an example, and it comes straight from this Judge Joe Brown and what they did to undercut his efforts, and it will show why they felt like this was necessary. He was the last judge to hear James Earl Ray's final appeal. So it went from 95 to 98. Of course, James Earl Ray died in 98. And he made some pretty important discoveries. This guy his expertise was in ballistics. And we'll get to that. But one of the first things he discovered was the gun that they said killed Martin Luther King and was tied to James Earl Ray could not have been the murder weapon. We'll talk why in a minute. That's a pretty important discovery right there. Secondly, that he found in the files, he found a homicide file that was written in protest to the Shelby County District Attorney's Office in 1968 from the Memphis police. They wanted it on record that they did not conclude the same as the FBI, and that Ray was the gunman who killed MLK. They came to an opposite conclusion that it wasn't James Earl Ray. They wanted their report on file. So it wasn't as open and shut as people were led to believe. And he found that report, which again had been withheld. And then he found that Ray was not even on the scene at the time of the shooting, which completely corroborates what the two eyewitnesses said. So in his capacity as judge in this appeals process, he's finding this out. He's starting to come to a sort of a conclusion on his own that James Earl Ray was railroaded. And since he's now the judge in charge of this case, he's going to try to right the wrong. And he gets really into this. He starts investigating a little bit on his own. Judges aren't supposed to do that, but he did. He discovered that Ray was not the self-confessed assassin the media made him out to be. I've listened to Judge Joe Brown say when he first got introduced to the case, the thing that stuck out in his mind as a judge was that Ray had pled guilty. And he knew that really didn't mean anything. The rest of us, when you say somebody pleads guilty, you think, oh, he must be guilty. But because of his job and because he's aware of the technicalities of his job and sometimes the strange route one has to take to try to clear his name, he didn't consider that to be open and shut, just because he pled guilty, that he was guilty. And he said, I probably was the perfect judge for James Earl Ray because I came into this with an open mind. That did not prejudice me to think he was guilty. Now, I didn't think he was innocent, but I wasn't prejudiced to the point where I thought he was guilty automatically because he pled guilty. And he cites this Alford precedent. This is something that James Earl Ray constantly talked about in the media. Now, They never explained what this was or why James Earl Ray was saying it. Earl Ray didn't confess. He pled guilty, but he didn't confess. He said repeatedly, anyone would listen, I never said, he said this in interviews, printed in the Tennessean on television. I never said I killed King. I'm pleading guilty because of Alfred. Now, if you don't know, if you're not Judge Brown, you don't know what Alfred is. That means nothing to you. But Judge Joe Brown knew exactly what Alfred was. It's a Supreme Court precedent that allows an innocent person to plead guilty if he or she believes that is his only course to save his life at this present moment. And of course, we already know because of what he told Pepper, he thought he was going to be executed. If he didn't plead guilty, he was going to be executed. That's what his attorney told him. So he took advantage of the Alfred precedent, pled guilty, realizing that this is just temporary and my real fight will be in my retrial. But right now, they're out for blood and they want to execute me. And I have an attorney who says he's not healthy enough to give me a defense. The judge won't let me fire my attorney. So I'm screwed. I'm going to be executed if I don't plead guilty. So they pled guilty. And so this is all part of the calculus that is going into Judge Brown's thinking at this point. Back to the gun evidence, because this is what really matters. Rifle evidence had convicted Ray in 68, but by 98, 30 years later, according to Judge Brown, those antiquated rules of the methodology when it comes to evidence back in 68, by 98, they were so outdated so as to be almost extinct. He said, we don't even use those kind of methodologies anymore. He said, by 98, modern scientific methodology excluded the rifle from being the murder weapon. It's sort of like DNA, and before DNA, people got convicted of crimes. And then once DNA was invented, we discovered they were innocent. And so you see the stories all the time of people being released after 30 years in jail because DNA evidence proved they were innocent all along. That's what evidence does as technology improves, et cetera, et cetera. And then what he found, which was stunning, was the FBI never conducted any ballistics tests in 68. So if there had been an honest trial in 68 and ballistics was called into question, the FBI never did anything. So he did. And what he discovered was probably the reason the FBI never did any ballistics testing in 68, because they knew what the results would be. The bullet pulled from Martin Luther King's body came from a gun that had a 1 11-inch rate of rifling twist. Now, I'm not an expert in guns. I'll say that right off the top. But what that means in layman's terms is that there's one turn per every 11 inches. So that means that the bullet turns one time completely every 11 inches. And I'm not sure if it's the barrel or if it's the actual airspace, if you want to say that. I'm not sure which it's measuring because the barrel, it's 33 inches long or whatever. I don't know. But I know that the bullet that was pulled from Martin Luther King's body, according to Judge Brown, had a 1 11-inch rate of rifling twist. And the bullet that they pulled from Ray's the Ray's rifle had a 1 10-inch rate of rifling twist. So let me see if I can explain this clearly. The bullet that they pulled from Martin Luther King's body came from a rifle that produced 1 11-inch rifling twist. All right. But the rifle that they attributed to Ray, which he confessed he owned or he purchased, but they said it was the murder weapon, only had a 1 10-inch rate of rifling twist. So what that means is they're two different guns. The bullet that killed Martin Luther King could not have come from Ray's gun. So this is why he said, without a shadow of a doubt, he didn't kill Ray because he didn't shoot that bullet that killed Martin Luther King. He couldn't have. His gun couldn't do the shoot. Furthermore, what he discovered was that the rifle that did kill Martin Luther King was an M21, which is a modified M14. That is a semi-automatic weapon that is almost exclusively back 68 used by the military. Now, we've already established the fact that the military was involved. And we have a witness that says Frank Strausser received a specially delivered gun on the morning of April 6th and spent the whole morning, or the whole day, at the rifling range there in Memphis police practicing with this gun, whispering about or muttering about how he was going to blow Martin Luther King's head off, saying racist things, et cetera, et cetera. So we have pieces of the puzzle to support what Judge Brown is saying, that the gun that killed Martin Luther King was a military rifle. Well, we already know Frank Strausser was using a specially delivered rifle that he had to practice on all day. We already know that the military had a sniper team in Memphis, and they were at the fire station. They'd been sent from Camp Shelby, and they had 2 snipers, they had a spotter, they had a photography team on the roof. We know that the military was involved in the selection of the alias, Eric S. Galt, for the patsy. So this is just like another piece of the puzzle to show that the military was involved. This goes, you remember what Dr. Pepper was going to write in his book, that the Harper and Collins president says, hey, you got to leave out that chapter about the military. This is part of that evidence that ties the military to the scene, right? And this is what Judge Brown has discovered. He also discovered that the ammunition itself was subsonic and the rifle had a suppressor. And I have found a picture here of an M14 rifle. Excuse me. With the scope, the suppressor on the end. The suppressor reduces the velocity to below supersonic, and in doing so, confuses the sound signature. Now, this is in addition to the echo chamber that was the field of fire. When you take the Lorraine Hotel, which sits down in this gully, or this little depressed area, sits down low, it's got that building there, and across from it is, in an upward trajectory, is this big retaining wall, and on top of that mound are a bunch of buildings. You fire any kind of bullet in that area there between those 2 buildings, you're going to have an echo. It is virtually like an echo chamber. You add to it the fact that they used a suppressor, they used ammunition that was subsonic, and they used a suppressor intentionally to confuse the sound signature. Now you got SCLC people pointing in a direction saying they thought the shot came from the bathroom window of the rooming house. And then you got that Memphis police officer who's the kneeling man, who's sitting there and he's pointing at me. He tells the police it came from that bathroom. The sound signature was intentionally confused by the use of the suppressor. Even though the range was so short, you're only talking about 50 yards. Point blank range when you put a scope on it. It was a Redfield sight. The whole gun was modified by Leatherwood Company. This is the specially delivered rifle, I believe, that the military provided to Frank Strausser to make the shot from the bushes. And then everybody who heard it, it was only one shot. And the fact that it had the suppressor confused the sound signature. You had some point, not everybody. I mean, Solomon Jones was sitting there and he said the shot came from the bushes. Earl Caldwell said the shot came from the bushes. There were other witnesses who said the shot came from the bushes, the housekeeper, for example. But the SCLC people, you see the famous photo, they're all pointing towards the bathroom window. And then the Memphis police officer confirmed that. And that became the narrative. The shots. So this is to create a diversion. Stop me if you've heard that before. To create a situation where people think after the first shot, that's where all the shots came from. Of course, in this case, there only was one shot. You remember Dealey Plaza, the first shot came from Texas School Book Depository, or the building behind it. I can't remember the name of it. Crap. Anyways, the direction of the Texas School Book Depository. Get everybody looking in that direction, and the kill shot came from the grassy knoll, right? RFK walks into the pantry kitchen, and here comes Sirhan point blank right in front of him. Kill shot comes from behind RFK as he's walking right into an ambush. But everybody's looking at the diversion. This is a way to create a diversion using sound. When you don't have anyone to see someone with a rifle in a window, or someone withdrawing a rifle, the muzzle of a rifle from the window. You don't have any witnesses that saw anybody fire. You've got to create a diversion, somehow get them looking in that direction. And this is what the CIA, especially military, that's what they're masters at doing. All right, so those are some pieces of evidence that Judge Brown found, but there's more. He discovered, this is a really key detail, that Martin Luther King was not even supposed to be at the Lorraine Motel that day. He was supposed to be at the Rivermont. And I've got the Rivermont picture here, top and bottom. Top photo shows how it overlooks the Mississippi River, sits high up on the South Bluffs. And, the Rivermont was where they stayed 2 weeks earlier, on March 18th. And they were scheduled to stay there again during the April visit. It has 550 some odd rooms. It was the flagship Holiday Inn hotel. It was a high rise. It was considered to be secure, very luxurious, very expensive. And if you're anybody of note and you're going to Memphis in 1968, you stay either downtown at the Peabody or you stay at the Rivermont. So Martin Luther King and his entourage were scheduled to stay at the Rivermont. However, the Invaders, which is another civil rights kind of a splinter group, which was founded in 1967 by Memphis college students who were unhappy with the pace of change when it came to Martin Luther King and his SCLC nonviolent approach. The change was too slow. They felt Martin Luther King was too accommodating, and he was so concerned about having the moral high ground that he wouldn't use violence as a tactic or a strategy. These were college students who were seeking to infuse Black power into the civil rights movement. Black power, you think of Black power, you think of Stokely Carmichael, Black Fist, right? You think of Malcolm X, By Any Means Necessary. You think of the Black Panther Party, Black Power movement. These were all rivals to Martin Luther King and the SCLC. And it represents a schism that was growing by 68 in the civil rights community between those disciples of Martin Luther King and those disciples of Stokely Carmichael, Malcolm X, et cetera, et cetera. And these are the divisions that the FBI provocateurs, these infiltrators, are trying to stir up. Divisions amongst the civil rights movement. And the Invaders, when Martin Luther King came to town, the first time they took note of the fact that Martin Luther King and his entire entourage stayed at the Rivermont. And they thought this is a perfect opportunity to smear him, to embarrass him, because here he is claiming he's coming to support garbage workers and launch his poor workers campaign, and he's staying down at the rich man, the white man's hotel. They called him uppity, that's a pejorative term in those days if you're in the civil rights movement, because that literally means you're white. You're trying to be white. And so they embarrassed Martin Luther King and his entire entourage into making a last-minute change in their itinerary. Instead of staying at the Rivermont, they switched their reservations to the Lorraine. The Lorraine is in the low-rent side of town. The Rivermont is in the elite side of town. The Rivermont offers security and protection, right? They couldn't have shot him in the manner in which they did at the Rivermont. The Lorraine is exposed to anybody. We'll get into some of the details of the Lorraine here in a minute. There's a movie out called The Invaders. If you want to check that out. The Memphis leader was this guy, Lance Sweet Willie Wine Watson. You see him down, and they always wore those black berets. Black was a pretty prominent color with the Black Power movement, obviously. Now, this is where Merrill McCullough comes in. Now, I told you he would come up again, and he has been referred to as the kneeling man His daughter wrote a book about him called The Kneeling Man. He's the guy in the red circle there that's kneeling over Martin Luther King, who's been shot. Um, Judge Brown did not believe the narrative about Merrill McCullough. Remember, Merrill McCullough was the uh, Memphis policeman who immediately verified that the shots came from the bathroom window of the rooming house. It was his expertise, it was his expert opinion that turned uh, this famous photograph into a fact. This became immediately the narrative. This became the story that went out that somebody shot Martin Luther King from that bathroom window in the rooming house. It was based on this expert witness. He verified the shot came from the rooming house. He was the first person to reach Martin Luther King. And he said, based on all of his experience, it was his expert opinion that that's where the shot came from. Now, who was this McCullough? Judge Brown didn't trust him. Judge Brown was suspicious. So he starts looking at McCullough's background and he discovers that McCullough was at the time of the shooting an FBI informant. Oh, no. He was an FBI informant. The FBI is the one organizing this whole thing. He was ex-military police. The military's involved. He was a career CIA employee, an asset, and he was an infiltrator into the invaders. Now, we just talked about how the invaders used a ploy to force Martin Luther King to change his itinerary from staying at the Rivermont to now staying at the Lorraine. And when you find out that it was McCullough who had infiltrated the invaders, it makes you wonder if he hadn't been told by somebody in the FBI or somebody in the CIA that as an infiltrator of the invaders, he needed to play his part to help shame Martin Luther King into changing his residence from the Rivermont to Lorraine for the purposes of this plot. It helps explain why the invaders were used in such a manner when you find out that they were infiltrated by this guy McCullough, who was working for the FBI as a paid informant and a career CIA employee. This guy was not who everybody thought. They thought he was just a Memphis police officer, just like they thought Frank Holloman was a retired FBI, now working for Memphis Fire and Police. They didn't realize he was on the phone every day talking to Jerry Hoover, doing what Hoover wanted him to do in Memphis. He was Hoover's man in Memphis. Well, McCullough was Holloman's man in the Memphis police. And I'm sure he was taking, or I don't know this, but you could see the flow chart. You got Hoover in Washington, Holloman in Memphis, and McCullough in Memphis. McCullough's on the ground. Holloman's in the ivory tower, communicating back and forth with Washington and Hoover. McCullough's carrying out the dirty work. And as such, infiltrated into the invaders, helped shame Martin Luther King into changing his residence, changing his hotel stay from the Rivermont to the Lorraine. And you look at who he is and you realize, good night, this guy, just like whenever you see, this is why Judge Brown's instincts were so dead on in this. They're so right. He didn't believe the story that McCullough just was in the right place at the right time. Memphis police officer just happened to know that the shot came from the bathroom window. And that testimony went forward and became, and still is to this day. If you go to the Lorraine Museum, they will show you the window that is still there. That's where the shot came from. It stood the test of time. That story that he started has stood the test of time. This is the book that his daughter wrote, Lita McCullough-Seletsky, My Father's Life as a Black Spy Who Witnessed the Assassination of Martin Luther King. It's called The Kneeling Man. And of course, that's her father. They're kneeling over Martin Luther King. So this is all stuff that Judge Brown is discovering. I told you I would circle back to the Lorraine Motel. Juxtaposing the Lorraine from the Rivermont, the Lorraine was a small, cheap, only had 28 rooms, hourly rate hotel. Now, anybody who knows anything about an hourly rate hotel, you know what that is. Okay, that's where prostitutes go. It was known as a whorehouse in Memphis. Rampant prostitution. It was not uh, establishment you'd expect to find Martin Luther King in, or anybody of any stature. It was listed in the Green Book as a safe haven for African American travelers in the segregated South. There's a good movie out about the Green Book. I can't remember. It might be called Green Book. I can't remember the name of it, but you should check it out. It's relatively new. It's about that Green Book and how important that was to African American travelers in the South, where they could find food, where they could find lodging, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this was one of these Green Book qualified motels. But uh, I think if you're putting puzzle pieces together in your head, this should sound familiar. How at the last minute JFK's motorcade route was changed to make a right-hand turn onto Houston and a left-hand turn onto Elm. You can't bring the shooter to the target, bring the target to the shooter, right? Last minute change. RFK, he was supposed to go down that long hallway, end up in the press conference. Instead, they took him to the pantry, kitchen, and then they were going to bring him right back to that same hallway and back to the press conference. But they rerouted him, detoured him through the pantry and the kitchen. Last minute change. Well, here's MLK, last minute change from the Rivermont, which was basically a fortress, to the Lorraine, which was wide open, exposed to everybody. Last minute change. This is why the CIA fights so hard, government fights so hard to classify their documents and withhold them from the public, because they contain methods that they use and then they reuse and they can reuse again over and over and over again. Another tactic that we've seen before, and we'll see it in this case, is what we call security stripping. In JFK's case, he had the Secret Service, and there was a systematic stripping of the Secret Service in the months leading up to the Dallas trip, on the day of the Dallas trip, and in the hours before, right after they landed at Love Field. His security was completely stripped away. By the time he got to Dealey Plaza, he was a lamb being led to the slaughter. In RFK's case, remember, they infiltrated the security detail, which named Eugene Caesar, and he was the guy right behind RFK, pushing him into the pantry and the kitchen. He eventually shot him. Well, here, Martin Luther King has a volunteer 6-man security team. These are Memphis policemen, sergeants, and detectives from Memphis PD who volunteered their time to stay with Martin Luther King during his trip to Memphis and protect him. And they were down at the Lorraine. One of them was on the firehouse roof. He was kind of an overview watch. The others were around the room where Martin Luther King was staying. 6-man security team. In the hours shortly before Martin Luther King was shot, an order came from downtown headquarters for all 6 of these Memphis police officers to report to headquarters immediately. Some of them refused to leave, about half of them. The other half went, so we'll check out what's going on. You stay here. This forced Memphis PD to send supervisors down to the scene and threaten discipline if the rest of them didn't go. Well, one of them still refused to leave. He was the guy on the roof of the firehouse. Of course, as we know, the firehouse was going to be a pivotal location for the military sniper team and the photography team. So he chose to stay on location, conducting an overwatch in the roof of the fire station across the street from Lorraine. So Memphis police sent 10 white cops to the scene. They handcuffed him, hog-tied him by his feet, threw him in a police car, backseat, and removed him from the scene by force. Now, all of this took time. Now, it's interesting, as Judge Brown is learning this, obviously you could see what's happening. They're removing his security from around him. But something else was happening which corroborates this whole thing. Martin Luther King was scheduled to go to a dinner that night across town at Reverend Billy Kyle's house, where his first wife, Billy Kyle's first wife, was preparing dinner. She testified later. They didn't really think they were going to get anything out of her, but as they're talking to her, she tells them the story. She ends up signing an affidavit saying that the dinner had been ready and that Martin Luther King and his entire entourage was running late. In fact, she had received several phone calls telling her, put the stuff back in the oven, warm it up, keep it warm. There's a delay. And she was frustrated because she got 2 or 3 of these phone calls, delay, until finally the go-ahead was given that he's on his way. So Judge Brown smelled a rat and he started comparing. He went and got the police report or the police timeline of this situation that happened with the 6 security officers. And he compared it to Mrs. Kyle's timeline and when she got these phone calls. And what he discovered was that the delays, the phone calls he received about the delays occurred the exact same time the Memphis police were trying to clear the 6-man security team. So essentially what that means is when they found out, when headquarters found out there were 6 of their own Memphis finest down there on the scene protecting Martin Luther King, they realized that's a problem. So they called down there and on a ruse say, hey, you guys got to come back to headquarters immediately. That's delay number 1. And then when they found out half of them didn't come, they had to send the supervisors down to say, hey, if you don't go, you're going to be disciplined. That's delay number 2. And then when one of them still refused, they had to call in a 10-man crew to arrest him, haul him away, handcuffed, etc. That's delay number 3. Finally, the 6-man security team has been cleared from the scene, and the word goes, the operation is now a full go. And that's when she received her 4th phone call saying, okay, they're on their way. And of course, as soon as he stepped out, he was shot. This whole thing was coordinated. He said, well, that would require somebody on the inside. All right, let me introduce you to somebody on the inside. This is Reverend Billy Kyles. This is where they're going. They're going to his house, the guy in the red circle. All right, he's on the inside. He's one of the civil rights icons, that was with Martin Luther King. The field of fire is now cleared of all these security personnel. So MLK and his entourage start to leave the Lorraine Motel. And this guy, Reverend Billy Kyle, according to Jesse Jackson, who was there, it was Reverend Billy Kyles who insisted that they leave through the front, unprotected part of the hotel instead of the back, the east entrance, or the east side, where, as you can see, you're protected by this little courtyard and the building from any shooters in the surrounding neighborhood. This is how they usually came and went from the Lorraine. This is the normal entrance and exit. There's an internal hallway that leads them to their rooms on the other side, but they would enter and exit here because it was protected. But in this particular case, Reverend Billy Kyles insisted, he told MLK, according to Jesse Jackson, hey, your fans are out there and they want to see you. And he, just like Thane Eugene Caesar, grabbed RFK by the elbow and escorted him into the pantry. Billy Kyles grabbed Martin Luther King by the elbow and escorted him onto the front balcony and then disappeared. I'll go ahead and I shouldn't tell you this, saving it for later, but it was Dick Gregory, one of those sources that I quoted earlier, who noticed that Reverend Billy Kyles was not in any pictures. And so years later, right before Billy Kyles died, he had him on his TV show and he asked him, why aren't you in any of the pictures? Where did you go? And Billy Kyles said, I ducked back inside the room. Why did you duck back inside the room? I didn't want to get shot. Why didn't no one had gotten shot? How did you know that somebody was going to get shot? Why are you saying that? And Billy Kyles told him, well, under the circumstance, I just figured that was going to happen. So it's not a stretch, although I cannot prove this. It's not a stretch to imagine that Billy Kyles was the man on the inside. He was the Judas. And his job was to get Martin Luther on that front balcony. And they were frustrated because there was this delay. And so Billy Kyles had to keep calling his wife, put everything back in the oven. There's been a delay. Put everything back in the oven. There's been another delay. Put everything back in the oven. There's been another delay. Put everything back in the oven. Oh, we're ready. It's green. We're coming. Oh, Martin, we got to go out the front, not the back, because your fans are out there waiting for you. They want to see you. Escorts him onto the front balcony, steps back into the room, shot rings out, Martin Luther King dead. So, and this is infiltration, right? You get somebody on the inside, just like they did inside the Memphis police with this guy. Where is he? McCullough. Merrill McCullough. Merrill McCullough's job was to be the man, the expert who was on the scene immediately thereafter, pointing out that the shot came from the bathroom window. He did his job. Billy Kyle's job was to get Martin Luther on that front balcony. He did his job. Everybody, the infiltrator into the invaders, their job was to shame Martin Luther into changing his hotel from the Rivermont to the Lorraine. They did their job. I mean, everyone had a job to do. And you break it down into such small components. The right hand doesn't know what the left hand's doing. In a conspiracy like this, you just have one little job. We saw it with the Lloyd Jowers. His job was to run out, grab the rifle, bring it back into his restaurant, into the kitchen, break it down, and hide it. That was his job. He didn't shoot anybody. His job was to go. He got $100,000 to do that one little job. And all this was orchestrated. You go back, it started in 66 when J. Edgar Hoover went to Missouri and said to the commissioner, the state commissioner, hey, I need you to profile everybody at the Missouri State Penitentiary, find somebody who could be used as a patsy. He did his job. And then they go to the warden, they say, we need you to facilitate the escape of this patsy. He did his job. And then they go, the military goes up, they meet with the guy, Eric Escalt, they say, listen, we're gonna be using your name for an alias, just play along. He did his job. It's just, and the surgeon who put the pillow over his face after meeting with the family, Russell Atkins Jr. family, the Dixie Mafia, he did his job. Everybody just did their job. Now, I started off this story about Judge Brown saying that eventually the legal proceedings are going to get sabotaged because Brown was fixing, in his own words, he has said so later, he's still alive, he still says it. If certain events had not interceded, he was going to find James Earl Ray did not kill MLK. All this evidence. He was convinced, and the government knew he was convinced, and they didn't know what to do with him. They were in a court with a judge who wasn't playing by their rules. And so they had him removed. They said he was biased. The Tennessee State Court of Criminal Appeals removed him because they said he was biased towards James Earl Ray. Why? Because his rulings appeared to give Ray hope for a new trial. They can't have a trial, not with all this new evidence. Just like they couldn't have a trial of Lee Harvey Oswald because he knew too much. People had, on behalf of James Earl Ray, people like Judge Brown, people like Dr. William Pepper, had gotten to the bottom of the matter and investigated and found the truth. And they would have, if they had had a new trial, torn the government's case apart. So they had to step in and get Judge Brown removed from the case. And while all that was being litigated, James Earl Ray died. And the case went away. So I started off saying I was going to talk about cover-up today and discuss with you how the government covers these things up. They conspire, they carry out the crime, and then they have all the leverage instruments to cover it up. And I think that was a pretty good illustration of the cover-up. Dr. William Pepper became a threat. William Bill Atwood became a threat, if truth be told. And then Dr. William Pepper became a threat, and Judge Joe Brown became a threat. And they're all neutralized in their own ways. They control the editors, the publishers to shut down Dr. Pepper. They take the case away from Judge Joe Brown to shut down Judge Brown. As far as I can tell, Bill Atwood was killed to silence him. So, all right, that's episode 4. Episode 5 is I'll wrap up MLK, and then episode 6 is interesting. What I do is I take these 3 cases, the JFK, the MLK, and the RFK, I put them all together, and I just show. I go through about 20 examples of how the methods are exactly the same, and how if you're paying attention, you see the patterns, and the patterns themselves implicate the government because no one else uses these same patterns, not to the extent, and no one has the reach the government has. So that's episode 6. So we've completed 4 of the 6 MLK episodes. I hope you're enjoying them. Until next time, I hope everybody has a great day, and God bless. Thank you.